we've been kind of chugging through Genesis, and we're still in chapter 3. We started chapter 3 last week, and I told you last week we probably would not finish it. So this is Genesis chapter 3, part 2. So if you have our app, you can go in and look at our notes there. You'll have to scroll through because I just put the same notes in from last week, so we covered about half of them last week. So we're going to start in Genesis 3, verse 14 tonight. So you can kind of scroll through the notes till you get there. If you want a PDF of the notes, a electronic file, which is a lot easier to read and you can print it, that's in the app as well. You just go to that. There's a web page there that goes to our website, and all of the notes for every Wednesday night are on that page. So you can just click and download it from there. All right, so we're starting right in the middle of a chapter, which is hard for me to do because I'm such a linear person. So, I asked. I don't know if you saw my post in our app today, but I kind of told you what we were going to be looking at and some of the questions we were going to be dealing with. So, if you had time to read through the passage, you'll notice the word "cursed" shows up in the passage. Right? Now, we normally think of Genesis chapter 3 as the part of the scripture where we're told when the curse happens. Right? That's when the curse, you'll hear it referred to as the curse. But when you're reading through the passage, you'll notice that not all the characters were cursed. Did you notice that? We're going to talk about it in a few minutes. I just want to see. Not everybody in the story gets a curse. Only two things get cursed. So we're going to talk about that and what it means. Now, I'm going to go ahead and kind of give you I don't know if you'd call this a disclaimer or not, but there are some things in this passage, because of the way they're translated into English, lead us in the wrong direction. English, and we're going to get to it, and I'll explain all this, but I'm going to say some things tonight that are going to challenge something that you might have thought your whole life about these verses, and I already know they're going to challenge you. And I'm just telling you up front, it's okay to be challenged, and it is completely true that you can believe something wrong your entire life up to this point. I know we don't like to think that way, and it's not a real big issue, so don't get too nervous. Okay, our theology is not going to crash and burn tonight. Okay, but the way that I read and study the Bible nowadays, I didn't always do it this way, but I want to study the text and let the text tell me what to think and believe. What I don't want to do is the opposite of that, where I take what I already think and believe and force it on the text. That's upside down. So I'm a text guy. I want to know what the original language said. I want to know what the cultural context was that helps us understand what they were saying, and I'm going to let that tell me what to think and believe. Okay? So we're going to do some of that tonight, and you're going to feel some tension because you've always thought something about a couple of these verses. Now, I'll tell you that about tonight. It's not a real big issue. It's not anything we really need to fight about. Next week is going to be interesting because we're going to get into Genesis 4, and I'll just give you a quick preview. What God says to Cain about sin is not how we tell people about sin in our modern times. So there's going to be quite a bit of controversy around that when we get to it next week. So I'm just kind of telling you ahead of time. Part of your homework after tonight is to go read Genesis chapter 4 and pay attention to what God says about sin, and then think about what you have always been taught about original sin or sin nature, and judge by what God says and what you think, and see if they match. I can almost guarantee they won't, but we'll argue about that next week, okay? So tonight, we're going to look, we've covered Genesis chapter 3 all the way up to the point where God starts talking to them about what's going to happen because they've committed this act of disobedience. And I told you last week, the word sin is not even in chapter 3. And that's a puzzle. It's like, I don't understand why it wasn't called sin. Now, the word evil is in there. The Hebrew word is ra, which it doesn't always mean moral evil. Sometimes it just means bad. It's less than good. So the word sin is not in chapter 3. It doesn't show up until chapter 4. We'll get there next week. So we've made it up to this point where God's about to make some pronouncements or declarations to the serpent, the woman, and the man. And he's going to talk about the way life is going to be from this point on. That make sense? Okay. Now, you're going to notice that in your Bible, it's indented. It's not in paragraph form. Verse 14 through 19. Is that true in your Bible? So what does that tell us? Do you remember? It's a poem. Okay, so we're reading poetic language. All right. Now, I'm going to teach you a little bit about that as we go. Biblical poetry, it's kind of hard for us to wrap our mind around, especially those of us from the South that aren't really into poetry. I don't know. Do any of y'all read poetry for fun? Not a single person. See, I was right. Okay. I don't enjoy reading poetry. I'm not a poetic kind of person. I do like music, and I write songs, which are essentially poems set to music. But if you read my songs, they're not very poetic. They're very literal. They're very concrete. I'm not an abstract thinker. I have a very good friend of mine who's extremely good at songwriting, and he's very poetic. And you have to really think sometimes about what is it he's singing about or writing about. My songs, you read them and you're like, well, yeah, okay, exactly, because I'm not poetic, you know. I don't talk about mountains and rivers and how those connect to your heart somehow. I don't know how to do that because I don't think that way. But biblical poetry has certain features about it that once you understand them, it helps you to understand what the writer's trying to do. Okay, so everything God's about to say about the way life is going to be from Genesis 3 onward is in poetic language. So we have to keep that in mind, that there are metaphors in here. There are some things that you should take absolutely literally. There's some things that have deeper meaning than just the words we're looking at. So it's poetry. We're all on the same page. Okay? All right, so let's just dig in. Verse 14, and this is God speaking here. And the Lord God, that's Yahweh Elohim, said to the Nachash, the serpent, because you have done this, is that big enough for y'all? Here we go. Because you have done this. Now, what does he mean by this? What has the serpent done? He's deceived Eve. Adam wasn't present during the deception part. She goes back at a later time, we don't know how long, and she takes from the tree. Adam is present when that happens, and she gives some to him. So the serpent, this was her claim to God. The serpent deceived me, and I ate. And then Adam's excuse is, the woman you gave to me, and I ate. So Eve says, I'm deceived, and I ate it. Adam says, the woman gave it to me, and I ate it. So there's a progression going there. So what the serpent has done, what he's guilty of, is deceiving the humans into disobeying God and taking knowledge of good and evil for themselves instead of allowing God to tell them what good and evil is, right? That's what we talked about last week, okay? Because you've done all that, cursed are you above all livestock and above all the beasts of the field. Now, sometimes readers take this right here and they think, well, that means he's actually talking about a literal snake because, see, there's livestock and beasts of the field. He's talking about animals. But you should be reading this as a differentiation. The serpent is different than all the livestock and beasts of the field, which we learned in verse 1. He's more wise and crafty and shrewd. And then now he's more cursed, so that it's clearly a different category. And we learned last week the Nakash is not a snake. It's a snake-like spiritual being of some kind. All right. Now, this word cursed, arar, and you have to roll your R. Can y'all roll your R's? Arar, okay. This is a word play, okay? And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we got more serious stuff to get to, but I'm just showing you what the authors do in Hebrew. The man and the woman were naked and they weren't ashamed. The word for naked is arom. The word for crafty, the snake, is arum. And cursed is arar. So there's a word play going on here. If you saw this in Hebrew, it looks exactly the same in ancient Hebrew. Now, later on, a couple thousand years after this was written, they started putting in little dots and lines and stuff to tell you where the vowels are, because in Hebrew there's no vowels. So it was just A-R-M, A-R-M, A-R-R in Hebrew. So if you were reading this in ancient Hebrew on the page, you would notice this. There's a word play. He's picking these words on purpose. Okay, now we can go into all kind of reasons why that might be happening. I'd probably just bore you to death. I just wanted you to know that. So there's some wordplay going on. So the serpent is cursed. Well, in what way is he cursed? And you'll notice this is a feature of biblical poetry. There'll be a statement made, and then the next statement helps you understand the first one. So you're cursed above all these animals. Okay, what does that mean? Next line fleshes that out. Okay, on your belly you shall go. Now, did snakes already crawl on their bellies? Yeah. Okay, there's no indication that snakes had legs at some time and that this is a zoology lesson about how they lost them. Okay, that's not what this is. This would make no sense unless the snake had some ability to get off the ground, which we talked about that last week. Most likely is in the seraphim type category, had wings. Okay, so he's cursed to the ground. He cannot leave the ground. And dust you shall eat all the days of your life. And he says, and I will put enmity, eba, which is hostility. It's very serious terms, an aggressive term. I'm going to put like hatred between you, this serpent, and the woman. Well, in what way? Next line. Between your offspring and her offspring. Now, when you think offspring, you think plural. Most of the time, you would think offspring is kind of, we generally think of it in plural terms. But in Hebrew, it's singular. So it's not, I'm going to put enmity or hatred or hostility between your offspring, many offspring, and her many offspring. That's not what it's saying. It's one. There's going to be one offspring, one descendant of the woman who's going to be at odds with this snake and whatever offspring he makes, which is a whole conundrum we'll get into in a minute. So we need to think singular. Now, so this starts a pattern. And by the way, in Hebrew, it's literally seed. The Hebrew word for offspring is seed. So between your seed and her seed, singular. So this begins a pattern because this offspring, which is called a he, singular, shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. Now, I don't like the ESV translation here because they translated two different Hebrew words into one English word. They are related, they're the same root, but probably a better way to read it is, he shall crush your head and you, the snake, will snap at his heel. Okay, so if you crush a snake's head, is that a deadly blow? Yes. If a snake snaps at your heel, could that be a deadly blow? It could, or maybe not. It just depends. depends on what kind of snake it was. It depends on whether you can get the poison neutralized or not, all that stuff. So the idea is this offspring of the woman, this singular man, is going to kill the snake while the snake is trying to kill the human. Make sense? Can I think of a time where, if we think of the snake as Satan, which we find out later in the New Testament that's who this is, can you think of a time where Satan is going to try to kill a man who simultaneously kills his authority? Okay, it's shaped like this. It's the cross. So he's going to try to kill, but the snapping at your heel, that could kill you if it's a venomous snake. But what we're supposed to think here, and the author does not know the rest of the story. He's just recounting what God said, okay? But it sets up a pattern. It sets up the story. So the rest of the story from this point on is going to show different conflicts between this spiritual force of evil and its offspring and the offspring of Eve. But there's going to be one offspring at some point that's going to complete this task of crushing the head of the snake. Make sense? Okay, so that's the evil versus human pattern that gets set up. One human is going to kill this snake and its offspring. Any questions yet? Okay. To the woman, he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. And how's that? Well, in pain you shall bring forth children. All right, so here's my disclaimer a while ago was about this. Okay? How many of you have always thought that this meant that part of the consequence of sin is that women have extreme pain in childbirth? That's what I always thought. Yes. Now, no doubt, it is true. It's extremely painful. I know nothing about it. I've witnessed it twice. The second one came before the epidural kicked in, so I'm very much aware. It's painful. And I watched it happen, and it looks painful. So I've always thought that's what this was saying until I read it in Hebrew. These words don't mean what they've been translated into English. All right? So, and I know you might be tempted to think, no, this is what we've always been taught, that's the way it is. All right, here's what that means, and then I'm going to show you the Hebrew. If we take the traditional view of this verse, this is what we're saying. God intentionally brought that pain to every woman, including Eve and everybody after her, because of something one woman did. Not a natural consequence. I will surely multiply this. This is something God's doing to women. So let's just think logically here. Okay, so let me just put that before you. Here's what it says in Hebrew. This word, isabon, does not mean physical pain. Everywhere else in the Old Testament, this word is never once translated to mean physical pain. Everywhere else in the Old Testament, it means sorrow or grief. It's emotional pain. Everywhere else, this is the only place in the Old Testament that we're led to think this means physical pain. All right? Now just let me get through the Hebrew, and then we can argue about it if you want to. I spent quite a long time on this because it shocked me. It's like, what? I've always thought this is the way it is, which I'm getting used to that. The more I study Scripture in the original language and context, I keep finding things that I'm like, I've been wrong about this for a long time. So it's okay. Just get used to it. Uh, so this word means emotional pain. This word, heron, means conception, not birth. Okay? You look exactly how I felt when I found this out. So if we take that into account, all right, so there's going to be an increase of sorrow or grief in the process of conceiving children. Okay? Just hold on to that. This next word, pain, is a different Hebrew word, and it does not mean physical pain either. It means struggle or difficulty. Now, the frustrating thing about this is if you go read every English translation, at least all the ones that I've read so far, all of them translate the words the same way the ESV does. All of them lead you to think this is about physical pain and labor and the delivery process of a child. The Hebrew words don't mean that, and they are not translated that way in the rest of the Old Testament. So what does that tell you? If it's translated something else, the rest of the Old Testament, and only in this verse is it translated physical pain, that tells me the translators, and I don't know them, I don't know their hearts, I'm not making any judgments, that tells me that they're going with the traditional reading of this because they don't want to cause a big stink about it. Okay? And that's something translators do on many occasions. But that's what these words mean. So it's emotional sorrow or grief in the process of conceiving children, and there'll be a struggle or difficulty in bringing forth children. And you would think, well, that's the delivery, the bringing forth, right? Not necessarily. This word in Hebrew kind of refers to, you might say, bringing up children or raising children. There are other words for the labor and delivery process in Hebrew, and they're not used in this verse. So, all right, so there's going to be emotional distress of some kind in the process of conceiving children, and there's going to be struggle and difficulty in raising children. That's what the Hebrew says. We good? I know you're probably thinking, yeah, I understand what you just said, but what the heck, right? I know, I thought the same thing. Now, remember, this is poetry, and I told you biblical poetry, often what they do is they will say something in the first line, and they will either say it another way in the second line, or they'll say an explanation in the second line that helps you understand the first line. If you go read Psalms, which is all poetry, you'll see things, there'll be a line that'll say something one way, and the next line will say kind of the same thing, but with different words. That's this thing that's going on. It's parallelism or whatever you want to call it. It's a way to explain lines of a poem. Okay, so the first line is, I will surely multiply your sorrow in conception, and struggle and difficulty you'll raise children. Next line, explanation. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. Now, I've been studying this for a long time and just arrived on this today. It's like a light bulb. The one line explains the other line. like a light bulb to me today. Um, and I had to go in and add it to your notes to get it in there. But I think what's going on here, and I could be wrong, but I think what's going on here is this second line: "Your desire shall be contrary to your husband; he will rule over you." I think that's helping us understand why conceiving children and raising them is going to be sorrowful and include grief and difficulty. So let's talk about the second line, and then we'll go back to the first, okay? Your desire will be contrary to your husband. By the way, your desire being contrary is a pattern that's going to get repeated in the very next chapter. Genesis 4, verse 7, when God's talking to Cain about sin, he says, sin, its desire, is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. That's what he says to Cain about sin. We'll talk about that next week. I'm just giving you a preview. Your desire will be contrary to your husband. What does that mean? Now, some translations say your desire will be toward your husband, or your desire will be for your husband. And a lot of people take that English translation and they think it's talking about sexual desire. But that doesn't really make sense, because sexual desire is not a result of sin. That was created in them in the beginning. They were given a task to be fruitful and multiply, right? So that's a bad reading if you think that's what this means. This is about control. Your desire will be contrary to your husband. Here's what he's saying. Because this has happened now, you were one flesh, and you had complete unity, and there was no shame between you, no emotional hiding between you. Now that you've done this, and you've taken this knowledge of good and evil on yourself, here's what's going to happen between you and Adam. You're going to want to control him, but he's going to rule over you. The Bible is really relevant, because what are most of our relational issues in our marriage? We're trying to control each other. Okay? Now, I'll just go ahead and drop another bomb on you. A lot of people think that when you read this verse, it's like, okay, it's God's will for husbands to rule over their wives. Let's think about the context here. This is a declaration of the consequences of the fall. This is not a declaration of how God wanted it to be. You tracking? You get what I'm saying? This is not a verse you should use to say men must rule over their wives. This is a bad proof text for that. This is God saying, this is the result of your bad decision. Here's what's going to happen now. You're going to find, Eve, that you're going to want to control your husband, but he's also going to want to control you. And the way that's going to play out is men are going to rule over women and mistreat women. It's going to be a common thing as a result of your decision. This is what's going to happen. It's not like God is saying this is what he wants to happen, or that he's even inflicting this on them as a punishment. He's saying this is what is just going to happen now, because now you've brought sin into the world. Okay? So how does that relate to the first line about the whole childbearing stuff? I think that helps us understand what the Hebrew is actually saying. This conflict between the man and the woman, do you think that's going to make having and raising kids difficult? Yes or no? Yes. That's why I think this line is an explanation of the first line. There's going to be a rift between you where you're going to try to control each other, and one of you is going to win. That's the way it's going to play out. One of you is going to win, all right? Because you don't want to lose, right? And you're selfish, and you want to dominate each other. So, and that word for rule, by the way, is not the word used in Genesis chapter 1 when it says, let's make man in our own image and they will rule and have dominion and all that. That's not this word. This is a different word. It means dominate, control. So you're going to want to control your husband, that he's going to control you. And that's going to create problems for your family. You're going to have problems even conceiving children because you're going to be at odds with each other. And when you do conceive, raising those children, it's going to be difficult, difficult, struggle, because you're at odds with each other. Now, don't we all know that to be true? How good are you at raising your kids when you're both trying to control each other? It's not too good, especially if your kids are seeing it. You think that might lead to some difficulty in raising your children? Of course. That's what he's saying here. This is not God making pain in childbirth. This is God saying, you're going to have a relational problem. I have made you to be one flesh, but now that this has happened and you've done this, you're going to have relational problems, and there's going to be times where you are not one flesh and don't want to be. And you want to rule and dominate each other. That's going to create a problem for your children, which in turn creates more problems for you. Make sense? Okay? No heresy here. I'm just telling you. This is what the Hebrew is saying. I think I'll just leave it there. I have some more things I could say, but I think I'll leave it there and we can talk about it as we go. Are we good there? You got any questions on that real quick before we move? All right. There's a pattern set up here. That's why I've got a P over desire. There's a pattern of gender conflict that begins. And you see this play out all through Genesis. These are just a few of them. In Genesis chapter 12 and 16, Abraham and Sarah, you're going to see one trying to rule over the other and deciding, instead of listening to God, they decide to do something themselves. Namely, let's take an Egyptian slave woman and let's speed up this process that God said we're going to have kids, and we too old to be waiting around on that. So that whole thing. Genesis 27 with Isaac and Rebekah, you're going to see the same thing play out. One's trying to rule over the other one or trying to manipulate their way into something. Genesis 29 through 30, Jacob, Rachel, and Leah, you're going to see a whole thing play out there. And then Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38. So this thread runs all the way through Genesis, and it's very clear. Once you get this pattern in your head, you're going to read every story and go, yep, here it is again, here it is again, here it is again. And you remember that the thing we talked about last week when they were ashamed? What did Adam and Eve do with their nakedness? They got leaves off of a tree and started dressing like trees, but it was like loincloths. It only covered. It wasn't modest. Okay, they just covered up the important parts. That whole thing sets up a pattern too of deceptive garments. This is in your notes. It's all in there. You can go trace it through Genesis. You're going to see that come up over and over again. So that's a big pattern that gets set up here. There's tons of patterns in Genesis chapter 3, and I've got most of them in the notes that I could find so far. I'll tell you this real quick. The Bible Project, which is I've always told you about that, and there's links to different videos in the app and in the notes. They're making an app right now, a Bible Project app, and it's about to go into beta version, which I signed up for. I want to test it out. I'll let you know when it's released to everybody. But just the little teaser video that they showed, it's going to be awesome. Because the way they're doing it is within the text, while you're reading like Genesis 3, it'll highlight things. And when you touch on it, it'll say, do you want to unlock this pattern? And you touch that and it'll just lay it all out for you. And you can go chase it. It's going to be awesome. You can change a Hebrew word to see the word plays. Instead of it being in English, it'll change it into Hebrew so you can actually see it. It's going to be great. It's going to be amazing. I'm so excited. A lot more excited than I probably should be. Okay, so that's what he says to the serpent, and to the woman. Now, was the woman cursed? No, the serpent was cursed. The word curse is not used when he's talking to the woman. She's not cursed. Interesting. What does he say to the man? Well, to Adam, he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife. Man, you're going to love this. And you're going to love it too much. Because you have listened to the voice of your wife. Do you think that's going to come up again in Genesis? Like maybe Abraham and Sarah? Whose idea is it to get the Egyptian woman Hagar and to have a kid? It was Sarah's idea. Can you just think about that for a minute? You go to your husband and say, here's another wife so you can have a child. And then what happens in the story? You'll have to go read to find out all the details. They should make movies about this stuff. It's the most interesting stories you'll ever read. She comes up with this idea, and then Abraham says, okay, and it flat out says, Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. Connection right back to this verse we're looking at. Same Hebrew words. He listens to her, and then when the baby's born, or really before the baby's born, Sarah starts to hate Hagar. And there's a whole jealousy thing going on, and that plays out. And it's terrible, okay? So what do we learn from this? Well, apparently don't listen to the voice of your wife. I'm just kidding. That's not it, okay? Men, there are many times you should definitely listen to the voice of your wife. If we didn't have wives, we would not live as long. They keep us from dying earlier, most of the time, in most cases. So you listen to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you. Notice he doesn't talk about commanding the woman. Why? Well, she wasn't there when that command was given. But he did command Adam. You listen to the voice of your wife, and I commanded you something. That's the contrast. You didn't listen to me, you listened to her. Okay? And I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground. Now, wait a minute, God. Shouldn't you be cursing Adam? And why didn't you curse Eve? You cursed the serpent, but you didn't curse Eve. And now you're not cursing Adam, you're cursing the ground. Interesting. I put some references here. I'll zoom in so you can see them. This kind of starts a pattern that you see again in Genesis 5 when Noah is introduced. His father names him Noah, which means comfort or rest. Noach. And he says maybe, he names him that, I'm going to name him Noah, because maybe he will bring us relief or rest from the ground that God cursed. So it shows up right there in Genesis 5, tying back into this. Now, we don't have a lot of time to go into this in detail. It's going to get fleshed out as we keep reading the story. But the New Testament part to help you understand this is Romans 8. You go to Romans 8, specifically verse 19 through 23, Paul talks about, for the creation itself is groaning because of what's happened in this world. And it's waiting for the revealing of the sons of God. See, in the Old Testament, the sons of God are spiritual beings all throughout the Old Testament. In the New Testament, believers in Jesus are now the sons of God. We replace the sons of God who have rebelled. So the rebellion that we see throughout the Old Testament of the sons of God, we replace them in the New Testament. So apparently creation itself, creation meaning the physical created world we live on, the earth, is groaning, and I think travailing is the way the Old English words it. It's like it's frustrated and wants to be redeemed. Interesting. It's almost like it's alive. So you can go read that and we can talk about it later. But so cursed is the ground because of you in Isabon. Sound familiar? That's the same word. When he was talking about Eve, you're going to have Isabon in conception. Heron. In Isabon you shall eat of it, the ground, all the days of your life. It's going to be just the act of trying to get something to eat is going to be difficult and cause you emotional stress and sorrow and grief. Make sense? Okay, so Isabon, Adam's not having babies. That word cannot be about having babies. It's about stress. It's emotional. So now, instead of being in this garden where you cultivate these fruit trees and fruit just falls off of them for you. It's not all that hard. Grab a piece of fruit, take the seed out, plant it. You get a whole nother tree that keeps giving you fruit. Pretty easy. Okay? In the garden, they're about to be put out of the garden, and now they've got to work the ground and try to get it to produce something they can eat. That's going to be difficult. Is it going to physically hurt? At times, but that's not the point of this word. This is going to be hard. That's the point. Why? Well, because these things called thorns and thistles. I always like that word, thistles, because we never use that word. But so there's going to be this stuff that grows out of the ground that's going to make it hard for you to grow good things out of the ground that you can eat. How many, if you've got a garden, if you've ever planted a garden, you'll notice the weeds, the thorns, the thistles, you don't have to do anything to help them grow. They just sprout right up almost overnight, right? You can plant everything and it's like all the weeds are constantly trying to overtake what you planted, right? Okay, so what's the curse of the ground? Well, there's going to be difficulty in getting it to do what you want it to do. Adam, because of what you did, this is what's going to happen. So it's going to bring forth these things you can't eat, and it tries to crowd out the things that you can eat. And you shall eat the plants of the field. Interesting. That's what the animals were eating in Genesis 1 and 2, the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. Wait a minute. Why are you sweating to eat bread? Well, because how do you make bread? Before you can put it in an oven, do you think Adam didn't have an oven? Okay. Before you get that far, what's the beginning part of bread? Huh? Oh, we're so American. Yeah, I don't even know. You have to plant something called wheat that comes up, and then you have to harvest it, and then you have to grind it up and make it into some kind of flour, and then you have to make it into dough. You're going to need some kind of rising, maybe yeast or whatever. There's a big process to this. Now, we don't know about it because we go to the store and go, here's some yeast and here's some dough, or not dough, flour and all that. And then you have to go figure out how to make that work, right? But that's easy. I mean, for some of you, it's easy. For me, it's a nightmare. But what he's saying here in this passage is really difficult. Not only do you have to make the bread, you've got to get the stuff that makes bread to come out of the ground and survive long enough for you to use it to make bread. Why does he need bread? Well, because now the ground is having to provide his food, and their plants, they're not lush fruit trees in a garden. They're about to be put out of the garden. So now you're going to have to work really hard to get the ground to work for you so it can produce something that you can work really hard into something that you could eat that'll last a while. Other than that, you're eating grass. See what's going on? Okay. By the sweat of your face, you will eat bread till you return to the Adamah. Remember, Adam was made from the Adamah, the ground. We're dirt people. Okay. Why is that? Well, because you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Was Adam cursed? That word wasn't used. Was Eve cursed? Was the serpent cursed? Okay, so we got the serpent is cursed, and what else is cursed in this story? The ground. Isn't it just a little bit interesting that we've always thought that humanity was cursed from Genesis 3 on, but in Genesis 3, it's very clear that the humans are not cursed? We'll dig into that controversy in the next chapter, okay? But the next chapter is going to help explain what I just said. It's just really interesting to me that the humans aren't cursed in this story. There's no curse put on them. The ground is cursed and their enemy is cursed. Now, so what does that tell us? Well, I think it tells us something about God's character and about how much he loves these humans he's made. Because he's cursed their enemy, and he's cursed the ground that they're going to live on and live off of, but he's not cursing them. I think we're supposed to notice that, and we're supposed to think, God really likes these humans. Yeah? Okay. He's already being gracious. He's perfectly within his rights to say, all of you are cursed. Good luck. But it even goes further than this. Okay? So, the poem's over. That was God's poem to the serpent, the woman, and the man. Okay? Back to the narrative. The man called his wife's name Eve. You might not realize this, but this is the first time she's called Eve. Before that, she was Isha, woman. All right? So Eve, that's what we say in English. In Hebrew, it's Hava. You have to hawk it up at the beginning there. Hava. It's the word for life. It just means life or life-giving. Because she was the mother of all living. And the Lord God made for Adam and his wife garments of skins and clothed them. Interesting. This word for garment means robe. God's going full coverage. Because earlier they made loincloths out of leaves. And what did we say last week? How long do leaves last? Not too long. This is not going to work long term. You're going to tear all the trees down trying to stay covered. All right? So he makes them a robe out of skins. And this word is the word for animal skins. Now there's an interesting word play here that we can't really chase down. I'm still trying to figure out what all it means. But in Hebrew, the word for skins, which is this one, handwriting's terrible, and the word azer, which was the word, in our English translations it gets translated helper, but as I told you, deliverer is a better translation. That's what the woman is called when God says, it's not good for the man to be alone, I will make an azer for him. a deliverer. Will deliver him from his loneliness. Okay? In Hebrew, if you didn't have these dots, these little dots right here, it would look like the same word. That's how they do Hebrew word plays. Okay? So, in the original Hebrew, they didn't have all these dots. That was put in later to tell you where the vowels are, because there's no vowels. It's a consonantal language. Not continental, but consonantal. All right. Boring Hebrew stuff. So there's some kind of thing going on here. We're supposed to connect these garments of skins with a deliverer or deliverance or salvation. The Hebrew wordplay is supposed to tell you there's something about these skins that have like a salvation meaning behind it. Yes. Dana got it. Gold star. To get an animal skin, what do you have to do? Well, you're going to have to kill an animal. Kind of hard to get the skin off of it with it alive. So God kills an animal and makes garments of skins. And the Hebrew word used is supposed to make you think about deliverance and salvation. Can you think of any other places in the Old Testament where animals are going to be killed to make atonement, to cover the sins and shame of the people? Yeah, like the entire Old Testament is going to be about that. The sacrificial system, all of that originates from this idea. God did it, so we're going to do this because he set up this pattern for us. What does God do? He kills the animal instead of killing the human. And he uses the skin of the animal as a garment, a robe, to cover their shame. Now this gets really deep, and we'd have to go into the book of Hebrews, which is a glorious book of helping you understand the Old Testament. But you really got to know some things about the Old Testament to even understand what Hebrews is talking about. But it's a beautiful book. Hebrews gets really deep into this idea, and it talks about how the blood of bulls and goats could never actually take away sin. It covered it. That's where this whole idea is coming in, okay? So that's a deep rabbit hole that we'd be here the rest of the night. So I found this verse that I thought I would include to help us with this. This whole idea of God clothing people gets picked up on in Isaiah 61:10, where it says we're going to be, through the Messiah, we're going to have a garment of salvation and be clothed with a robe of righteousness. God's going to cover our sin with his own righteousness. Isaiah 61 is telling us that's exactly what he did for Adam and Eve, and it's what he's going to continue to do for the humans. All the way into Isaiah, all the way into Jesus. You see that? So this is a pattern. Then the Lord God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us." Remember that plural language in chapter 1? Let us make man in our own image. He's talking to the heavenly host. The man has become like one of us spiritual beings that know the difference between good and evil. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Does that sound awkward? It sounded awkward because I sounded like I was going to keep talking, but the sentence ended. It's an incomplete sentence in Hebrew. It's weird. That's why I got a question mark right there. It's like, that doesn't sound like you finished the thought. But that's where the quotation ends. That's when God stopped talking. So there's this idea that if the human stays around the tree of life and can eat from the tree of life, he'll live forever, but he'll live forever sinful. He'll live forever in this state of redefining good and evil for himself rather than trusting God for it. He'll forever be in this fallen state, and he'll never die. How's that going to turn out? To have eternal life, but to be eternally sinful. That's not good, right? How's that going to work for the mission of spreading out and being fruitful and multiplying and their original job? Well, it's not going to work out too good if everybody is perpetually sinful forever. Nobody ever dies. Can you imagine look how evil it got even with them dying. Just in a few chapters, God's having to completely reboot the system because they've already gotten so violent and evil. So he says, look, we can't have him eat from the tree of life and live forever in this current condition. He's got to die. We got to get him out of the garden. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out. That's I think I wrote it over here. That's a exile pattern that starts. Being exiled from the land. He sent him out of the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. Okay? So God drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. The end of chapter 3. What in the world's going on here? Well, a quick note about this. He drove out the man at the east of the Garden of Eden. So they're gonna be driven out in the direction of east, and the entrance is at the east of the garden, the entrance to the way to the tree of life. So you're going to see in Genesis chapter 11, they're going to start migrating from the east, and then they all come together instead of spreading out and build a tower. So he's already given you this indication that they went out toward the east, and a few chapters later you're going to see they come back from the direction of the east and build a tower. It's actually not a tower, it's a big staircase trying to get God to come back down. We'll get there in Genesis 11. It's going to be a while, but so he drove out the man toward the east, and at the east place where you come in to go to the tree of life, he put these cherubim. They're in the same category as seraphim that we talked about last week. If you want to know more about cherubim, just read the book of Ezekiel. They show up a few times, and they are strange creatures. They're like hybrid creatures. They look like animals and humans combined. They're multiple animals, and when you read the description, you're like, that sounds terrifying, and that's what you're supposed to think. You're supposed to think, when I come into a place where God's actual presence is, and I see that thing, I'm not going that direction anymore. They're there to protect you from coming into God's presence and dying from it, because your body could not handle it. Okay? So the prophets, Isaiah and Ezekiel, get to see these things in visions. They're not literally there. They see a vision of heaven, and they see these. Basically, in the ancient world, they're called throne guardians. And multiple cultures have some form of this, protecting the throne of their god. So if you go to Egypt and you look at all their hieroglyphics, you'll see these weird hybrid animal creatures. They're usually somewhere around the god that they worship. This was an ancient way of thinking about things, okay? So he placed a cherubim to protect the garden. Now, in chapter 2, we were put there, not we, Adam and Eve were put there to serve and protect the garden in chapter 2. In chapter 3, a divine or a spiritual being is put there to protect the garden from us. You see the flip? Like, we were supposed to do the cherubim's job, protect it, work it, serve it, keep it, which are priestly terms throughout the Old Testament. Now, we're put out of the garden, and there's protection put in place so that we can't get back in. Why? Well, because now we're sinful, and we'll mess that place up. Okay? Now, the interesting thing about this is if you go into the descriptions of the tabernacle and of the temple, if you were to see a picture of it, I wish I could probably find it, but it would take a minute. Every curtain that divided the entrance to the layers of the tabernacle and temple have cherubim on them. And that's how we know that the Garden of Eden is supposed to be, we're supposed to think of it as a temple. It's like a temple. It's where God's presence resides. The tabernacle and temple after the garden are modeled after the garden. That's why there's a golden shining tree lamp in it. That's why there are divisions that have cherubim on them to keep you out and remind you. If I walk into God's presence, that thing on the curtain actually exists, and I can't go past that curtain. Right? And then there's this flaming sword thing, and I tried to track down what in the world's going on here. And to be honest, there's very few scholars that even talk about it because there's just not enough information for us to know. When you first read it, you think of it as, okay, there's this cherubim, and then there's like a weird flying sword turning like this every which way. I think what we're supposed to read is the cherubim has a flaming sword turning, and I think the cherubim and the flame with the sword is turning every way to guard. That's what I think we're supposed to get. But I read it and I thought, I wonder if there's some weird spiritual thing about swords. There wasn't. And they're guarding the way to the tree of life. That's Genesis chapter 3. Okay, questions? Yeah, when you see popular images of angels, they just look like these sweet creatures that you would love to hang out with. First of all, let me say this. This will help clear up some misconceptions. There is not a single angel in the Bible that has wings. The seraphim have wings and the cherubim have wings. Angels always look like humans. Every single time. There's not any passages that describe them that way. They look like a human. They are mistaken for humans. And in a lot of the Old Testament story, when Jacob is wrestling with God, remember that story, and God dislocates his hip? He, as far as he knows, this is a human. But he senses this is not your everyday human. Three humans walk up to Abraham next to a tree. It makes sure to point out that they're by a tree. And he finds out these are angels, and one of them is Yahweh. So Yahweh coming in the form of a human is actually an Old Testament idea. It's not a new idea in the New Testament. So if you're talking to a Jewish person and they say, well, the whole idea that God came as a human is ridiculous, that's a New Testament idea. You can take them in their Torah, their Old Testament, and say, well, what do you do right here where God, the three men that come up to talk to Abraham and then they go on to Sodom because they're about to kick butt at Sodom? The text literally tells you one of those men is Yahweh. The angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, when it uses that exact phrase, oftentimes it's Yahweh in human form. In Hebrews, it tells you to be careful how you treat strangers because they might be an angel and you don't know it. I've got a story about a guy named Tom that showed up at our small group one night that one of our group members picked up that I don't know, But it was so, yeah, Matt and Devin, yep. hmm That, I swear, if when we get to heaven and I see his name, he told us his name was Tom, and I see him, that's the first question I'm gonna have is, are you really a human? Because that was a weird encounter, and I left there thinking about that Hebrews passage. Be careful how you treat strangers. No, they weren't. They were not eating meat in the garden. There's no record of humans eating meat um, until Noah gets off the ark, and God tells him, "You can now eat meat." Why now? Well, because there's nothing. The whole earth has been land. Well, I should say land. The land has been destroyed. Therefore, there's no trees to go eat from. So you're going to have to eat animals. They had to figure out how to get plants to grow that they could eat or make into something to eat, like wheat to make bread. Because outside the garden, you don't have you don't have this beautiful place that has all these fruit trees that God planted Himself. You're just going to be stuck with what you can find. Yeah, it's not Taylor County where there's just trees and grass and it's a tough environment. Yeah, so now they're going to have to make the ground do all the work, and then they're going to have to do all the work of what comes out of the ground to make it into something they can eat and somewhat enjoy. So because they're not in the garden, so it's not that God is forcing all these consequences on them. It's that because you have exiled yourself from the garden because of your actions, this is what you're going to have to deal with now. So, so the ground is cursed in some way that it's going to keep working against you, but you're going to have to rely on it to grow something to eat in an area that, at least in today's time, um, you don't just you don't just dig up some sand and plant something and it just grows. I mean, it's not like it's not enough moisture. Especially east, if you're talking about the land of Israel, which my personal opinion is, Eden is the land of Israel. Geographically, I think that's the land of Eden. And the garden, personally, I think the garden might have been Jerusalem. Um, but none of that exists yet in the story. But so they go east of there, which would have been the area later would become Babylon. They come back from that direction. So um, the land of Israel is a wonderful place, and it is easy to grow things there. I won't say easy, but it's a very lush place. That's why they describe it later in the story as the land flowing with milk and honey. It's like, man, you don't even have to work at it in this place. They got grapes this big. Um, but outside of that region, it's desert all the way around it. So to the north, you've got um, modern day Turkey, back then Asia Minor and all that. That's very desert like and mountains, desert going all the way around where Iraq and Iran and all that is now. Back then it was Babylon, Assyria, and then below that you got Egypt. So around that whole area there, there's this nice green spot, but everywhere around it's tough. Um, I personally think, and I guess just opinion, okay. I personally think that the garden was taken away as people multiplied and things became a lot more violent. I mean, the very next story, we're going to have a murder at the entrance of the garden. So, what's that? Right. You have a flood that that's that's going to destroy the place. Um, I think the next time you're supposed to think the garden is back in some way is as you read through Genesis when they come back to this area. Every time they have some crazy encounter with God in this area that they don't have elsewhere. So you'll just follow that as you read throughout the story. You'll notice it, even way further than Genesis. You'll see Jacob shows up on this in this area, and that's where he has a vision of the ladder that goes up to heaven, and the angels going up and down on it. And he says, "This is a place where God lives." So he puts a stone there and all that kind of stuff. So you'll see that pop up throughout the story, that there's something special about this place. God tends to do things, speak and give visions and stuff in this place. And then the next time you see something resembling the garden is the tabernacle, which is a portable temple. And they're trying to get back to the place called the Promised Land. Eventually the temple will be built there on the mountain of Jerusalem. Jerusalem shows up in Genesis, but it's hidden. You have to really pay attention to see it. The whole Melchizedek story, Abraham and Melchizedek. Melchizedek is a king and priest of Salem. That's how we pronounce it, because it looks like Salem down the road from here. But it's Shalem. It's ancient Jerusalem, before it was called Jerusalem. So there's a whole rabbit trail with Melchizedek. Don't ask any questions about that right now. That'll take forever. Any other questions about Genesis 3? Okay, so God's response to the humans are not cursing them. He's not cursing the humans. There is no curse on the humans. There are consequences, but not a curse. That's very important, especially what we're going to talk about next week. And God kills an animal to cover their sin. God's response is, I must get involved. When the humans are sinning, when the humans are messing things up, God decides to come get involved. That's a pattern that gets set up here. So that's what we're not just learning about humans in this passage and a snake in the ground. We're learning about God's character. That's what the author is wanting you to do. He's wanting you to learn about yourself and humanity and why things are the way they are. Why is it that weeds come up and we're not even trying to get them to grow? Well, it's because there's been a curse on the ground, and the ground is groaning in itself because of what's happening. And we're not good to the ground either. I'm not an environmentalist guy, but the more I study Genesis, the more I think we're supposed to be taking care of the place. And we're not treating it very well. And all the solutions to all the environmental alarmist group, all their solutions are to treat it worse. They just don't tell you that part. Y'all need to drive an electric car. Really? Do you know what that's going to do to the earth? We start digging up that much lithium for batteries, and where are you going to store them when they die and you can't replace them? Oh, we're going to bury them. That's good for the earth. So, sorry, I listened to a whole podcast on climate change stuff today, and it's blowing my mind. There's a good book if you like to read. There's a good book. I haven't read it yet, but I heard the author explain what he talks about in it for a couple hours today. It's called Apocalypse Never, and it's about climate change alarmists that are scaring people by lying to them. So anyway, if you're interested in that, you can go check that out. I don't know that the guy's a Christian. He didn't say anything about that, but I don't think he is. But sounded interesting to me. Okay, homework. Any more questions before we move on? We can hang out afterwards too. So here's your homework. I want you to read Genesis chapter 4 and think about these questions. And these are in the app and on your notes. And like I do every week, I'll post them again to remind you. Where do the events of Genesis 4 take place? Pay close attention to the details in Genesis 4 and try to figure out, where is Cain and Abel? Where are they located when these things are happening in this story? So go pay attention to that. What in Genesis 4 reminds you of things in the first 3 chapters of Genesis? So how is it related, or how is it contrasting something? Just how is it connected? Um, and then I want you to pay very close attention. What does God say to Cain about sin? What does God say to Cain about sin? Cain is a descendant of Adam. He's the first offspring of Adam and Eve. So you would think he's got a sin nature. Yes? Yeah. Next week's going to be fun. So I just want you to think about your idea of what sin nature and the idea of original sin, that whole doctrine. I want you to have that in your head, but I want you to pay very close attention to what God said to Cain about sin and see if it matches up with what you've always believed about the curse, which, remember, the humans weren't cursed in chapter 3. So next week's going to be fun. For maybe. So just pay attention to that. And then pay close attention to how does God respond to Cain's sin. Just pay very close attention and compare it to chapter 3, how he responds to Adam and Eve and their sin, or their raw. So the word sin is not used in chapter 3. Okay? Where do the events take place? What's connected back to the first 3 chapters? What does God say to Cain about sin? How does God respond? I want you to please do your homework this week. You need to have thought through this before you get here next Wednesday night. It will go much better if you've thought through it ahead of time. If not, some of the things that I'm going to point out to you are going to shock you. You will be less shocked and more mindful of the issue if you do this ahead of time. Okay? So go think about it this week. Study it for yourself. Don't Google it. Don't get on the internet and try to figure out what everybody else thinks. I don't want you to do that. And I'm being serious. I want you to read it for yourself. And then we'll talk about it together. Did the ancient readers of the Old Testament have Google? No. Did they have multiple theologians walking around arguing about what everybody should think about everything? Not the early readers of Genesis did not. They had the story, and they got together as a community and discussed it. So don't go consult a bunch of theologians, because let me tell you what theologians are good at. Some of them are good at staying with the text. A lot of theologians, and I know a lot of them and have read tons of books from them, they love to have a system of theology that they impose on the text. We're going to flip that upside down and let the text tell us what to think. Okay? That's what we're going to do next week. Go study, read it multiple times, pay close attention. We'll talk about it next time. All right, let me pray for us, and then if you got more questions and want to hang out, we'll do that.